Podcasting from Hartford, you're listening to the Connecticut Scoreboard Podcast, your place for all things Connecticut sports.
All right, UConn Vanderbilt, a much awaited matchup this week in college football here. So joining me today, we've got Aria Gerson. She's from the Tennessean. Aria, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So to start, again, as I mentioned, I know a lot of people are somewhat looking forward to this matchup this weekend. I know UConn and Vanderbilt both have been having some down times in college football, but I know Vanderbilt to start has brought in a new coach this year. What's been the mindset there and the culture that's in the midst of being worked on there at Vanderbilt?
Right. So Clark Lee's the new coach, and his biggest thing has been just kind of about like starting from the beginning, really. Like he calls this team Team One, just to kind of say that like what came beforehand, wasn't Vanderbilt or shouldn't be what Vanderbilt is going forward, and to just kind of wipe the slate clean. Now, that's a pretty difficult thing to do when your roster is in the state that Vanderbilt's is, which, obviously UConn knows a thing or two about that, but that's kind of the philosophy, and just, about learning how to win is something he's big on. He will not, I think Vanderbilt will take wins where they can get it. They beat Colorado State and they were pretty happy about that win. So, they're not probably going to beat any SEC teams this year, but the hope is that, they didn't win any games last year. Vanderbilt went 0-9 last year. So winning one game is an improvement over last year.
In terms of what Coach Lee is bringing to the table, for a UConn fan who hasn't tuned in to watch Vanderbilt this year, what's the style of play like under Coach Lee, and what can they expect from one of these Vanderbilt teams?
Right. So, Clark Lee is a defensive coach. He came from Notre Dame. He was a defensive coordinator at Notre Dame. And his defensive style is like a 4-2-5 type, which is very different from, what they were playing before. It's definitely like they have a lot of hybrid players on the defense, players that can be, hybrid pass rusher linebacker types or linebacker safety types, depending on certain packages, or, they have different people on the field depending on what the situation is. And, that's partially to help develop, younger players. And because the pass rush hasn't been great this year, just trying to figure out how to, get something done on defense. Offensively, it's kind of, I think it kind of varies depending on the game, depending on what's working in the game. They used a very run heavy approach against Stanford, but it was a lot more pass heavy against Colorado State. The wide receivers, there's a lot of talent at receiver and at tight end. Although Vanderbilt's best running back is out for the season. So that is, they don't have a lot of depth there, but they've had some, the run game was pretty good against Stanford, and the pass game has been up and down, but there's at least some potential there that, there's been flashes. They can't do it consistently, but, I think when it's working, there's a lot of RPOs. There's a lot of, different guys that can be open downfield, or, if the run game's working, then that's obviously an option. And then Vanderbilt has a second quarterback that they use sometimes, who's more of a mobile quarterback, a dual threat who, has made a lot of things happen in the quarterback run game. So that's another wrinkle that Vanderbilt might bring on the offense as well.
It's funny you mentioned that. I think that's a perfect segue, because I was going to ask, what's up with the two quarterback situation, and what's that whole situation been like?
Yeah, so basically these two players, Ken Seals and Mike Wright, they both were on the team last year, but they're both sophomores. So they haven't played a full season. They, just had the COVID season that was SEC only last year. Now, Ken Seals, who's the starting quarterback, he was actually pretty good last year. He had a completion percentage of 65%, and he set a bunch of school passing records that were originally held by Jay Cutler. So, and this was against only SEC teams. So he was, not too bad last year. And there was a lot of thoughts that he was going to, take another step forward, but he really has regressed so far. And it's kind of unclear, he turns the ball over a lot, and that was always an issue with him. That was an issue last year too, but it's just like he's never really been able to get in a rhythm. And then the second guy, Mike Wright, he comes in usually when Vanderbilt is losing. So bring him in to try to get a drive going by using the running game. But so far this season, at least, Mike Wright has actually, when he does throw, which is not that often, but when he does, he has been even less efficient than Ken Seals has. But he is able to gain a bunch of yards with the run game, mostly because it's just a different look, because Ken Seals is more of like a pocket passer. He doesn't run too much. And so, the reason that Clark Lee is sticking with Ken Seals is because he thinks that Mike Wright kind of, I guess, plays hero ball a little bit, in the sense of he tries to always make a play himself. And, if he was the primary quarterback, that can work when it's specific packages. But if he was the starting quarterback, you can't just run the ball yourself on every play, because teams are going to take that away. So the usage has been a little bit strange, in my opinion. I don't completely understand what they're trying to do with it, just in the sense of there's not a ton of rhyme or reason to when Mike Wright comes in. It's kind of just, if the offense has been pretty bad, they bring him in. But it's not like Ken Seals is getting benched, because then they'll bring Seals back in. So it's very...
It seems a bit random there.
It's a little bit random for sure. But I think my guess would be that if Ken Seals does, get on a roll against UConn, if he's doing well, that I think Clark Lee will stick with him. And I think Mike Wright is more, if there's a bunch of drives in a row that are stalling or whatever, that he might be more of an option at that point.
All right, interesting. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out Saturday night. In terms of some of the other guys on offense, whether you're looking at some of the running backs or the receivers, who are some names that UConn fans should be on the lookout for?
Yeah, so I'm going to start with the receivers. I think Chris Pierce has been Vanderbilt's, go-to target this year as far as the receivers go. He's been a good downfield threat. He's a very experienced player. Cam Johnson, he had some potential NFL hype last year. He's a slot receiver, and he's very good as well. Ben Bresnahan at tight end, he got injured in the first game of the season. And so he missed 2 games, and then he played last week, but he didn't do much. But apparently, according to Clark Lee, he's back this week, fully. Mm-hmm. So potentially he could get in more, because he is, or has been when healthy, one of the best players on the team and on the offense. It's just a matter of him staying healthy. So their main running back right now, I mentioned their best running back, or their top running back, was out for the season with an injury, but their current starting running back is Rocco Griffin. And he is another player who's kind of been up and down. But against Stanford, he actually had 2 runs of 30 plus yards. So he does have some big play potential at times, especially if the offensive line is doing really well, which they looked a lot better against Stanford than they did in the first couple of games. So he could be a big play threat at running back. So I would say that they really just roll with those same guys. They make very few substitutions on offense. It's really just the same guys the whole game. And that's probably who is going to be the biggest threats.
And then looking on the flip side of the ball, on the defense, a name or two to be on the lookout for.
Yeah, so I think that on the defense, you have the Ethan Barr at linebacker. He's been pretty good. And Davion Davis is a defensive lineman. He is one of the team captains. And against Colorado State, I think it was, he had multiple pass breakups at the line of scrimmage. So he has been, quite good. And so there's also Elijah McAllister, who he's struggled with injuries a lot throughout his career. He missed all of 2020 with injury. He has been kind of quiet so far this year. He hasn't recorded a ton of stats, but he's got a great body, great athleticism. So he's definitely has a potential to be a problem. He's a pass rush type player. And so he comes in like pass rushing situations usually. So he could be another one to keep a lookout for.
I know that this might be a tricky one, given that the Vanderbilt's a one-win team, and I'm sure if you asked me the question, I'd be the same from UConn standpoint. But what would you say is the biggest strength of this Vanderbilt team? Like, what can they do well to beat you at the game?
Yeah, so I think that Vanderbilt has shown, at least on the defense, that they are able to make some adjustments during the game. In most of the games, I think all of the games so far, the defense has played better in the second half. And a lot of the points that they've given up have actually been due to turnovers and things like that weren't really the defense's fault so much. Mm-hmm. So while the defense isn't great, you sometimes will see them give up a couple scores early and then they kind of settle in. And so the goal now, and Clark Lee has hammered this in basically every press conference he's given, is like they need to start faster, like they need to be better at the beginning of the games. But I have been impressed with their ability to kind of make those adjustments to kind of, it really showed against Stanford. They gave up some stuff early, but in the second half, the defense was actually like quite good. Now it was too late to actually win the game, but they have been able to kind of make those adjustments and to kind of settle in and to more stop to start making stops. They've had a lot of bend but not break type of thing. They've had multiple goal line stands, one against Stanford, one against Georgia, so I think that the defense, they play hard no matter, like even if the game's out of hand, they will start making stops. They're not going to let up.
On the flip side, what's the biggest weakness of this team that UConn could possibly exploit to have a chance to win this game?
Yeah, I think it's the turnovers. Vanderbilt turns the ball over a lot. And, it's been so many different things. Like there's sometimes Ken Seals will throw an interception. There's been a couple strip sacks, and some of those strip sacks, obviously it's partially on the quarterback and it's partially sometimes that, an offensive lineman or a running back or a tight end misses a block and like pass rushers are like constantly in his face. So, you kind of have a two-way street there. There's been turnovers on kickoffs, punts, like just basically any way that you can imagine there being turnovers. Like Vanderbilt's probably had a turnover. Now, they had a lot of issues with penalties earlier in the season, but they've really cleaned that up. I've really been impressed with the way that they, against Georgia, which is a very disciplined team, they had very few penalties. So I think that they have cleaned that up a lot. But the turnovers are still a huge problem because when you're already struggling to score, I mean, against Georgia, it was like they turned the ball over like 3 consecutive drives, or it might have been 2. It was 2 or 3 consecutive drives. And like Georgia just kept scoring with the short field, and it just was not good. And you can't do that if you're struggling to score. So Vanderbilt's going to try to avoid some of those really, really negative plays.
Was there anything good you could take away from that game against Georgia where you could say, hey, the score was ugly, but maybe there was one thing here or there you could take away as a positive to take into the rest of the season?
Yeah, like I kind of already mentioned it. I think the biggest positive was the penalties. They've really, really been cleaned up. They were cleaned up against Stanford as well. Like the beginning of the season, the first couple games, there's like false starts, like constantly, pass interference, like special teams issues. Like now against Stanford, they had special teams penalties, but the offensive penalties and the defensive penalties were almost completely gone. And against Georgia, they kept that up. Almost no offensive penalties. I think they had one false start, and I think it was on a punt. So like that was it. They had like very few penalties against Georgia. And again, against a team that good, that's a team that's going to start that's going to try to force you into those penalties. And so I think it was a really good sign that they really seem to have cleaned up that situation and have really started to kind of avoid so many of those penalties. I also, this is, a small consolation, but their punter is really good. Harrison Smith. He's great. Vanderbilt has been a little bit shaky when it comes to like kick and punt coverage. Okay. So they had him do a couple like rugby type punts against Georgia just to like not have him return it. But he's good. So, he can flip the field, which Vanderbilt needs somebody who can do that. So those are some things that I would say, I have noticed about that this team has done really well through even in the Georgia game.
Yeah. No, it's going to be an interesting game Saturday. Definitely a battle out there. I'll get you out of here on this one. I'm just curious to get the feel of what the attitude and the morale around Vanderbilt football is like right now. I know they've been going through some tough times. We've seen it up here in Connecticut. What's the attitude of the fan base like around the team right now?
Yeah, I think the fan base is really, they're used to Vanderbilt football being pretty bad. They've been bad for, if you take out they've had a few good years, especially under James Franklin, but other than those, they've been bad for decades. So, the expectations are pretty low, but regardless, it's just kind of a weird transitional period right now because nobody is really sure in terms of the current situation on the team. It's obviously really bad. It's worse than it was, a few years ago, but it's unclear how much of that, was the old coaching staff and how much of that is the new coaching staff. So it's really, I think people are unsure what to think. They're not sure if this is we hired the wrong guy or if it's just a matter of he needs to get his guys in and have more time because I do think regardless of who the coach is, this is not a situation that you can turn around in 1 year.
Yeah.
But I just think that it's kind of been, they don't go in expecting a win against any team really, but, and they're used to being punched in the gut. But I do think that they're just kind of cautiously waiting to see more and hoping that it gets better at some point, even if it's not this year, that maybe gets better next year or at some point, and that it just had to do with the previous coach, coaching staff and COVID, because COVID, impacted recruiting and it impacted a bunch of other stuff that was kind of the root cause of this.
Right. I'm sure you're surprised to be there and see this Vanderbilt team as a double-digit favorite heading into Saturday. I don't think you'll see that much this year, but Aria, really appreciate the time. Looking forward to the game on Saturday, and thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening to the Connecticut Scoreboard Podcast with Jared Cutler. If you like the show and want to know more, check out the podcast on Twitter at CT Scoreboard Pod, the host at Jared Cutler, and find us on Facebook at the Connecticut Scoreboard Podcast. Finally, if you enjoy what you're listening to, rate and review us on iTunes. Thanks again for listening.